keep riffing on some of these topics. Watch my last video where I read some excerpts from Hellinger's book and Acknowledging What Is. There's so much in that book that I want to pour over it and take some notes in my journal, especially the parts that are just radically confronting to our normal notions of what is ethical and progressive. For example, Hellinger has stated that incest victims often are done a disservice when the perpetrator is despised and rejected, and when the role of the mother in an incestuous relationship where the father is sleeping with his daughter, when the role of the mother's abandonment of the husband is not acknowledged as playing a role, which has been very controversial because people then say, oh, you're just blaming the wife. And actually, Hellinger, I'll go into this, Hellinger says the blame is shared between both parents, and that he's just acknowledging these dynamics that he's witnessed within family constellation work, in which the actual healing in the incest situation occurs by way of the victim of the incest acknowledging the depth of their love for the perpetrator, which of course is not the usual approach. And so I bring this very intense example up because I think it demonstrates how extraordinarily unique Hellinger's perspective is in his focus on resolution and what is practical. In other words, he follows what will actually allow resolution based off of what he's observed works to accomplish that, even if it is at odds with our moral ideas. And by the same token, an extension of that is to recognize the degree to which our moral ideas of what is right or wrong actually hinder and get in the way of resolution. Another example of this would be women's anger at men and the feminist movement, which of course, if you watch my last video, you'll very much see that Hellinger is not in any way saying that women shouldn't be asserting their importance and their power in society. He sees that as a good movement. However, he's simply pointing out that the moral outrage and indignation and the demands based in bitterness and the devaluation of the masculine that is a natural consequence of being mistreated is practically not what is going to resolve the issue. And I think it's easy to lose sight of this when we've been hurt, when we're confronting these power struggles and these differences that men and women have, and we also acknowledge that we are embodying and perhaps unconsciously entangled with an enormous amount of resentment from our ancestors, from things that happened to our ancestors, which Hellinger would say the solution, although that's a natural thing that happens and it's hard to disentangle from it to the extent that it's unconscious, that in fact, a lot of what I love about how practical he is that he recognizes that a lot of suffering and a lack of resolution comes about by way of us being involved with things that are essentially not our business. And that there's an efficiency of the flow of love that can occur when we recognize what is ours and what is not ours. And where we accept what is our fate and we accept what is someone else's fate. In other words, the things that are fate, where if we acknowledge what is, the things that have been fated to happen cannot be changed. And so there's a huge amount of frustration, inefficiency, heat, anger generated with this frustration of essentially what it is. It's a sense of a lack of control and an attempt to control things that are beyond our control. And also, I think what goes along with that is an inflated sense of responsibility, which is grandiosity. If we think that we can repair past hurts by way of holding people accountable, for example, all men, for the poor actions of their ancestors historically, then we are being extraordinarily impractical, which doesn't mean that it's not natural for that anger to exist. I think it's more just a question of maturity, and in Hellinger's view, view, it's also a differentiation between ego-based consciousness and soul-based consciousness, that the ego is extraordinarily impractical. However natural it may be for the ego mind to react in the way that it does as an animal, in retaliation, in self-assertion, that we're unlikely to really get very far if we're using that type of consciousness, no matter how much empathy we have for how natural that reaction is. That if we really want resolution and we really want healing, and especially if we just look at this empirically, we have to be honest enough with ourselves to ask ourselves whether the indignation and the contempt and the bitterness, no matter how justified it may be, is actually getting us the results that we want. And I think that this distinction is really important for me to bring to the forefront of my consciousness, because I'm someone who certainly has felt confused about and easily overridden by my sense of justice or injustice, which really is ultimately a form of moral superiority that is based in a misguided belief that I have control over another person, that I have as much influence as I do, or that I can reverse fate, or that anything that did happen shouldn't have, right? And so this work is really helping me to come to terms with how inefficient and therefore how impractical it is to go about one's life being upset about that stuff, and also taking on other people's burdens and overgiving to or getting entangled in causes that are ultimately none of my business. This is another way of saying that maturity has a lot to do with allowing people to reckon with their own fate, leaving people to their fate, right? So if my ex-husband did something to me that was unconscionable to my mind, he could certainly, hopefully, if he's conscious enough, come to terms with the fact that that's irreversible and that consequences exist. I think that what Hellinger is saying is that reconciliation is actually coming to terms with the irreversible consequences of one's actions. And one's actions are often things that we don't even have control over. And it makes the person innocent in certain ways. But it's sort of like a lot of our anger and feeling of upset towards people who treat us poorly is based in this assumption that the person has complete control over their behavior. And it's just simply not true that all of us at all times have complete control over our behavior. So it's very misguided to think that if we can't even control our own behavior, that therefore we can control other people's behavior, or that we can expect other people to always be acting impeccably to the extent that they don't always control their behavior. And one reason why a lot of people's behavior isn't controlled is because they are unconsciously entangled with these energies from the family, because they have not, the life circumstances and their fate has not taught them yet sufficiently how to discern what is theirs and what is not theirs. And to some degree, that is our fate, that it's inevitable that we are entangled. We are entangled with our family's energies, right? We are entangled with other people's business. We are entangled with these unconscious loyalty conflicts and these unconscious belief systems that have been passed down to us. And life is this process of becoming increasingly conscious and becoming at least somewhat less entangled. So I guess all I'm just saying is that I think that it requires an enormous amount of maturity if we say we really want a harmonious family or balance between the sexes. It takes a soul level, whole systems perspective to ask ourselves, practically speaking, what does that really require of me? Because what's going to happen is the ego mind is going to actually usually get in the way to hijack the very ends that we say that we want, because of these senses of injustice, of demand, of morality, of judgment, that as it turns out, as natural as they may be, are not indeed the things that allow love to flow. So I'm really excited to look further into this question of the central question I ended the last video with, which is this question of, if someone treats you poorly and you look down upon them, because this is certainly what I've experienced, You look down upon that low behavior and you develop a superiority complex in response to the way someone else acted with their own superiority complex to mistreat you. You're just matching the same energy with the same energy. How is it possible to bypass the superiority complex, which I would say is really that sort of animalistic tendency towards, if you feel threatened, to assert oneself by trying to dominate another since they were trying to dominate you? How can we actually honor and respect someone who has disrespected us? And I think it has something to do with acknowledging fate and accepting what is. And I'm sure there's more to it. I mean, I know the little I can remember from Hellinger's framework that I can wrap my brain around as far as how that can be accomplished is it really has to do in a family system with simply acknowledging, I mean, what we're honoring with someone who has dishonored us. We're not honoring their behavior, obviously. What we're honoring in the case of a family member is that they provided life. So my ex-husband made me a mother and gave life, and that is a profound gift. And I think that we often dishonor other people because we lose sight of that. We lose that bigger picture perspective of how profound of a gift that is. And I think that when we get angry with someone and we try to reject certain behavior, in the process we tend to not know, how can I still include this person and allow them to belong in my heart and in the family, which is just a fact that they do belong. How can I not exile them while actually putting up a healthy boundary towards abusive behavior? And I have not figured out the answer to that yet, but I have a feeling Hellinger has some pretty good clues there that are outside the box thinking that I am unlikely to find anywhere else. So I'll keep you posted.